Well, hey everybody, it's Mr. Schauber, and welcome to our discussion on American industry, the years 1860 to 1915. This is really the time when America starts just burgeoning, exploding technologically and industrially, and we become a world power during this time. You know, this is the time when inventors and scientists, backed by business leaders, create an explosion of inventions and improvements in American life. And so, real quick, let's contrast daily life. Daily life, the year the Civil War ends in 1865, with daily life in 1900. Now, this is for the average American. Of course, there's going to be outliers, but these are for people who kind of live in the cities where these improvements uh, have happened. First of all, daily life, the year the Civil War ends, 1865. Indoor electric lighting did not exist. Rather, the rising and setting of the sun dictated the rhythm of a day's work. For light around the house, people lit candles or oil lamps. Also, there was no refrigeration. People used ice blocks, which were very expensive to keep things cold. For poor people, they cut ice out of frozen ponds in the winter and packed them in sawdust and stored them for later. There's no way to keep things cold other than doing that. In 1860, most mail from the East Coast took 10 days to reach the Midwest and then 3 weeks to go to the West. An immigrant living on the frontier would wait months for news from relatives in Europe. Now let's contrast that with daily life in 1900, just 35 years later. By 1900, life had changed drastically for millions of people. So between 1790 and 1860, the Patent and Trademark Office of the federal government issued just 36,000 patents. Now, what are patents? Well, let's look. Patents are a license to make, use, or sell an invention. So again, from 1790, basically the time of the Constitution, until just before the Civil War in 1860, Patent and Trademark Office of the government issued 36,000 patents. Okay. In contrast, between 1860 and 1890, just 30-year span, 500,000 patents were issued for inventions such as the typewriter, the sewing machine, and the phonograph. So when a person has an idea for an invention, they draw it out, they write up an explanation, they explain how it works, and you send it to the patent office. And uh, if they if nobody has developed something previous uh, like your invention, and if it can work, then they will issue you a patent, which gives you and you alone permission to make, use, or sell the invention. So the point is, the number of patents just took off after the Civil War. And as I mentioned, you can see here, 500,000 patents in just 30 years. And these are some of the things, just a few of the things that start improving the American life after the Civil War. And so by 1900, American standard of living was among the highest in the world. So too was our productivity, which is the amount of goods and services created in a given period of time. We were just pumping out products in our factories like crazy. Now, in 1850, before the Civil War, steam-powered ships still provided much of the nation's transportation. But in the following years, railroads started to make a huge impact. Before the Civil War, most of the nation's railroad tracks were in short lines that connected neighboring cities, mainly in the east. But trains were dangerous, and no system of standard signals existed, and train brakes were unreliable, if you can imagine that. But after the Civil War, the rail business improved greatly, and the key event was the building of this: the Transcontinental Railroad, which is a railway extending from coast to coast. The railroad, this project began in 1862, actually during the Civil War. And by this time, rail lines already reached from the East Coast to the Mississippi River. Now, new rail lines had to be laid between Omaha, Nebraska, which is basically as far as the railroad went from the east, from Omaha all the way to Sacramento, California. And if they could build that, that would connect coast to coast. A person could literally get on the train in New York or Boston and go all the way to California. So to do this, government involvement was key. the federal government awarded huge loans and land grants to two private companies to build and finish off this Transcontinental Railroad. One of these companies was the Central Pacific Railroad, and it laid track from Sacramento and went eastward toward Omaha, Nebraska. A lot of the workers were Chinese. The Chinese had some of them had been here already for the gold rush a decade earlier, and many others came over because this was steady work and it was hard work. It was brutal work, especially the Central Pacific, starting in Sacramento, has to go over the Sierra Nevada mountains, okay, between California and Nevada, and so they're having to blast their way through the mountains to create railroad lines. And who knows how many people died? We'll never know, probably, how many workers died trying to build this railroad through these steep mountain ridges and through the mountain. But the Chinese really were responsible for building the Central Pacific Railroad part, if you will, of the Transcontinental Railroad. The other company that got huge grants and money from the government to build the Transcontinental Railroad was the Union Pacific. The Union Pacific started in Omaha and went west toward California. Their workers were Irish, they were blacks, ex-Civil War soldiers, you name it. But these are guys looking for jobs, and because the railroads, the project between the Central and Union Pacific starts during the Civil War, but it will continue on after the Civil War. And so it actually goes from 1862 to 1869, so 7 years. And so there's all kinds of people who are looking for work after the Civil War, and even during it out west, that work for these railroad lines. Um, you know, those that worked for the the Union Pacific, these guys, you can see on the map here, where they're going to be building is a lot more flat terrain and a lot more, it's quite a bit easier than what the Central Pacific had to do. So they were able to put down a lot more track on average per day than the Central Pacific. But finally, after 7 years of grueling labor, the two crews approach each other. Now, no one knew ahead of time where they would actually meet up, but of course they had to meet up somewhere so this Transcontinental Railroad could be finished, and no one knew exactly where, but they're approaching each other in our state, Utah. And on May 10th, 1869, at a place called Promontory Point, Central Pacific President Leland Stanford raised his hammer to drive in the final golden spike. You can see that famous picture there, the Central and Union Pacific lines meeting up with each other at Promontory Point here in Utah to finish off the last of the Transcontinental Railroad connecting coast to coast. And so by 1870, railroads carried goods and passengers from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But trains were still noisy, dirty, and uncomfortable for travelers, but still much better than walking or riding a horse or taking a covered wagon. In the years following 1870, though, their travel continued to expand and improve. Steel rails replaced iron rails, and track gauges and signals became standardized. A guy named George Westinghouse developed better air brakes for trains, and Granville Woods patented a telegraph system for communicating with moving trains. Scheduling was another issue, though, that trains came up against. In the 1800s, most towns set their clocks independently according to solar time, when the sun rose and set. And so when trains started regular passenger service, they had to be, quote unquote, on time. Well, what are we going to do about that? Before we get to that, real quick, you can see here's what the Transcontinental Railroad looked like when it was finished. You can see the Union Pacific portion and the Central Pacific portion, and meeting up there at Promontory Point. Amazing that they did this. This is incredible. But like I said, the trains had to be on time now. So how are you going to do that? And so they had to create a national system to do that. You can see by 1905 all the train lines that existed. So once the Transcontinental Railroad is finished, railroad building just continues to take off and just goes crazy. And you can see all the lines that connect all the cities. And of course, if a rail line ran through a town, usually that town became a decent sized city or a big city after a while because it was a center of trade and travel. But now back to the way to keep things on time. You're moving people around, you're moving goods around from place to place. Trains have to be on time, right? And so uh, the time differences that had existed between towns created chaos. So in 1883, the railroads adopted a national system of time zones to improve scheduling. And these time zones still exist today. We have four major time zones in the continental US, and then Alaska and Hawaii are on their own respective time zones based on location. But we have the Pacific time zone out west, the Mountain time zone where we're located here in Utah through the Rockies, the Central time zone, which is a big swath of the country, kind of in the Midwest, and then the Eastern time zone. And so, for example, if it's 6 in the morning in Los Angeles, it's 7 in the morning in Salt Lake, and it's 8 o'clock in the morning in Dallas, and it's 9 o'clock in the morning in New York. And so that's just how things work. And so now the trains can be on time. And so by the end of the 19th century, some 190,000 miles or rails linked businesses and their customers. And shipping costs dropped enormously because of this. And so the railroad transforms the United States. And remember, one of the major things after the Civil War was rebuilding railroad track in the South, the southern part of, and that, of course, that was mostly in the East, right? But the southern part of the Eastern United States, and then, of course, fixing up and improving rail lines in the North. Well, that's after the Civil War. And then, of course, you just saw the map. The rail lines just go crazy and go all over the country. So railroads change lives. You're able to travel now in a matter of days from the east to west coast instead of a matter of many months. And this just, goods now can go all over, and people can get news faster, and people move around a lot more. It changes everything. Well, now let's look at some of the inventions. Not that railroads were necessarily invented uh, during this time, of course, but they were improved upon. But let's look at some of the inventions and perfections of inventions that happened uh, during after the Civil War times, and that changed lives drastically as well. Using this system um, that had already been invented of the telegraph, Samuel Morse perfects the telegraph. The telegraph is a way to send messages over a wire to each other. Now, of course, these are not spoken messages. There's no words involved. These are well, let me explain it. Samuel Morse, how he perfects the telegraph is he devises a code of short and long electrical impulses to represent the letters of the alphabet. So he takes what had already existed to some degree and he makes it better and much easier to use. Isn't that the key, right? Morse's system of these electrical impulses that represented letters of the alphabet is called Morse code. And you can see there on the right uh, how each letter was represented. By the short impulse was the D, and the longer impulse was the Da, and that's how you would tap out a a message. Now, it was kind of a tedious process, a rigorous process. People had to learn the language. They had to learn Morse code to be a telegrapher and do that. And it was a specialized thing. But but if you wanted to send a message, uh, you would go to, for example, you'd go to a telegraph office, which we'll talk about in just a second. These offices open up, and you would have your letter or message written out, and a telegrapher would take it and they would type it out and send it to the appropriate place across the wires. Like basically, these telegraph wires were like telephone wires or lines that we've grown up with, and at least I grew up with, and that connect areas and city to city, town to town, state to state. And the message would be sent across the wire, and a telegrapher on the other end would receive it and and then your friend could go and pick it up, the message from a from that telegraph office, or they would deliver it to your friend, and that's how a message was sent. And it was a lot faster than writing a letter and having the mail system carry it for you. But you know, it, and you would of course pay them to send your messages and so forth. But that's how this worked. That's the short of it. That's the simplified version of it. But to be a telegrapher was tough. You had to learn Morse code and really know what you were doing. So after the Civil War, then once Samuel Morse kind of has perfected this Morse code, and Morse code is now kind of the standard way of sending telegraph messages, here's what happens. What happens is several telegraph companies join together to form the Western Union Telegraph Company. And in 1870, just 5 years after the Civil War ends, Western Union had more than 100,000 miles of wire all over the place in this country. By 1900, the company owned more than 900,000 miles of wire and was sending roughly 63 million telegraph messages a year. So that's how Western Union, which still exists today, and now they wire transfer money around to places, but they used to be the main telegraph company, and incredible, right? I mean, just messages are being sent all over the country now through Western Union. Well, now let's look at something that you all know a little more about, the telephone. In 1871, Alexander Graham Bell of Scotland immigrated to Boston, Massachusetts, to teach people with hearing difficulties. His wife was deaf. Um, he wanted to make it so that deaf people wouldn't basically be deaf anymore. He wanted to make it so they could speak. He wanted to try to, uh, eradicate this deafness and allow them to speak not in sign language but audibly. Of course, he's not looked upon very favorably by the sign language community because he was really insistent on trying to get deaf people to conform to his way. But here's what happens. After experimenting for several years with an electric current to transmit sounds, Bell patents what he calls the talking telegraph on March 7th, 1876. He just turned 29 years old. And then 9 years later, after continuing to improve upon this talking telegraph, that we call the telephone, Bell and a group of partners set up this. What they created was American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T. Yes, the same AT&T that you know. And AT&T is made to build long-distance telephone lines that would connect town to town and city to city and state to state, eventually crisscrossing the entire nation. Now, the earliest phone lines could connect only two places, such as a home and a business. But then central switchboard offices were built with local operators that could link an entire city. So if you wanted to make a call, you would pick up the phone, it would connect you to the switchboard office, an operator would answer and say, how may I direct your call? You would tell them where you want to call, and they would literally use switches or plugs to connect where you were to where you wanted to call. And that's how you linked your phone call. And so it actually worked like that for many, many years in this country. It doesn't, of course, it doesn't anymore, and a lot of people don't even have landlines in their homes anymore. We use cell phones, of course, now, but that's how the telephone business gets going. And of course, once people are able to afford telephones, they're expensive at first, but once the price comes down and it becomes mass produced and people can have a phone in their home, they absolutely prefer this to the telegraph because you can actually hear the voice of the person that you want to talk with. So really, the telephone business takes off through AT&T and because of Alexander Graham Bell. Now, let's look at Thomas Edison, perhaps the greatest inventor in the history of the United States. In the late 1800s, scientists began developing new uses for petroleum. including fuels such as gasoline that would help power new machines. But electricity proved to be another effective energy source. The question was, or the key was, how do you harness it? Well, the work of Thomas A. Edison helped make electric power widely available to the masses. While working for a New York company, he improved the stock tickers that sent stock and gold prices to other offices. His boss was so pleased with his work that he awarded him a $40,000 bonus. And this is in like 1876. And so $40,000 back then was just a tremendous amount of money. And the boss, and Edison was only 23 years old at the time. And he got this huge bonus. And his boss thinks, man, of course I'm going to give him this huge bonus and he's going to love it. He's going to stay here and work for me forever. And what did Edison do? Well, he said, thanks for the money. I quit. And so in 1876, he moved his quote unquote invention factory to Menlo Park, New Jersey. And he sets up his invention shop in his basement, and that will become his laboratory. Now, Edison had never received any formal science training, but he claimed that he could turn out, quote, a minor invention every 10 days and a big thing every 6 months or so, unquote. Can you imagine that? His brain just worked that way. And so Edison started inventing, and he invented thing after thing after thing, and just things that amazed people. Edison's favorite invention was the phonograph, which recorded sounds on metal foil wrapped around a rotating cylinder. And you would crank the thing, and you would talk into it, and then you could play it back. It was like the first tape recorder, basically. The first words Edison recorded and played back on his phonograph were, "Mary had a little lamb." That very well could be the first words a human ever heard themselves say back. Kind of crazy. This wondrous machine, the phonograph, which eventually would become, a way to play music, and then became the record player down the road, right? This was introduced in 1877. Gained Edison the nickname the Wizard of Menlo Park. People were just amazed at what he could do. Edison also invented the motion picture camera. Well, think about all the implications of this and what this gives rise to. It gives rise to the movie industry, eventually the TV industry. I mean, you think about everything the motion picture camera will do for society. It's incredible. And Edison also experimented with the electric light bulb. His goal was to develop affordable in-home lighting to replace oil lamps and gas lights. The key was he was trying to produce light within a sealed glass bulb. He needed to find a material that would glow without quickly burning up when heated with an electric current. He could run an electric current up into the bulb, he knew that, but he had to find the right filament, that little line that goes across those wires in the middle of the bulb. He had to find something that would not just burn up when the electricity hit it. He experimented with, they say, thousands of different fibers and filaments and all kinds of things until he finally found something that would work. He found that in a filament of bamboo fiber. And when it glowed, Edison said it was the most beautiful light ever seen. Other inventors later improved upon Edison's work, of course, but Edison will get credit for his breakthrough with the electric lighting. And in the 1880s, people who wanted electricity had to produce it with their own generator. That's, of course, how Edison had to do it to start with. But Edison will develop the idea of a central power station. And his first power station was in New York City, a station that would store and harness electricity, and then from there it could be used to send out to various locations. In 1890, power stations across the country provided electricity for lamps, fans, printing presses, and many other newly invented appliances. In 1885, George Westinghouse began experimenting with alternating current with a guy that worked for him named Nikola Tesla, who many people consider just as brilliant, or perhaps even more, than Edison. And this alternating current could be produced and transmitted more cheaply and efficiently than the direct current, the DC, that Edison was working on. He used a device called a transformer to boost power levels at a station so that electricity could be sent over long distances. And so by the early 1890s, investors had used Edison's and Westinghouse's ideas and inventions to create two companies, General Electric, GE, which is still around today, and Westinghouse Electric. These are major power companies that start providing electricity to people and businesses around the country. And by 1898, nearly 3,000 power stations were lighting some 2 million light bulbs across the land. Amazing. This, like I said, this is a time of mass invention, mass creativity, and mass innovation in American history. This is incredible. So, what did electricity allow for? What did it allow people to do? Well, it made the refrigerator possible, for example. It transformed the world of work and it created new jobs. The electric sewing machine, first made in 1886, led to rapid growth of the ready-made clothing industry, right? I mean, all of a sudden you're able to pump out clothes out of these factories so quickly compared to the past. Um, but still, the farming areas weren't so lucky. They went without electricity for many decades after this. The electricity, the phones, things like that, those were available for the city folk and the city dwellers. And so the farming areas got those later. Let's look at some other inventors and innovations in the late 1800s and early 1900s as well. Of course, the airplane, right? Wilbur and Orville Wright with their airplane, their first flight in North Carolina, December 7th, 1903. That's going to transform history. How about the Model T car? Henry Ford. He says, I want to pay my workers so they can afford my product. And he did. And not only did they afford the product, but millions of Americans afforded the product. He makes the car affordable for the average person, the average family. And the Model T is the breakthrough in automobiles. Just to look at this, I mean, just for an example of what the Model T did, you can see at first cars were really expensive, had to be kind of handmade, custom made. Henry Ford comes along and figures out that he can use the assembly line to mass produce his cars, and you can see the sales data and the price data. The price in 1909 was huge, right? The sales were small, but by the mid 19 teens, he was mass producing these cars. And so the price went way down and the sales went way up. And of course, his bank account went way up as well. You can see the advertisement, the 10 millionth Ford. Crazy, huh? That car for $295. Brand new car, $295. Can you imagine? Well, Henry Ford's going to be included in this, and some other great inventors and business tycoons are going to be included in this next topic that we'll cover. And that is, were these people good guys or were they bad guys? Well, one way of looking at these guys was that they were robber barons. Okay, these powerful industrialists that own these huge businesses, uh, that they were these these guys who had built their fortunes by stealing from the public. They paid their workers hardly anything, and they forced them to work in dangerous conditions, and they got rich and fat off it type thing. So you can see the robber barons are there on the right, the fat cats, and the poor workers, are just fighting for scraps on the left there. And so were these guys robber barons or were they captains of industry? Let's look at that. Were they captains of industry? Were they not bad guys? They were good guys. They served their country in a positive way. They created all these jobs by creating these big businesses. They allow people with the money that these people make at their jobs to buy new products, and they use their money to to donate to to found museums and libraries and universities. A lot of these guys became philanthropists. And so, in this era really of the birth of big business, which Ford will be a part of course, and a couple guys we'll talk about in just a second. Uh, I want you to keep this in mind then. Were these guys robber barons or were they captains of industry? Were they doing things that were detrimental to the public or were they helping the country? Okay, and these are, you know, and obviously two different people would have different, maybe, you know, completely different views of the same person. You could look at the one business leader, and if you liked him, he was a captain of industry. And if you didn't like him, he was a robber baron. So keep that in mind as we move along here. All right. One of these guys who could be a captain of industry or a robber baron, depending on your view, was Andrew Carnegie. By the time he was 30 years old, the year the Civil War ended in 1865, he was making $50,000 a year, a huge amount of money for back then. And he wanted to invest his wealth. Uh, an immigrant from Scotland, little guy, short little guy, he was a bulldog when it came to business. He was fierce. So he wants to invest his wealth. And so during the early 1870s near Pittsburgh, he founded the first steel plants to use what was called the Bessemer process to refine steel, which was a more effective way to make steel. And these grew into the Carnegie Steel Company, which I'll show you a picture of here. But Carnegie creates a monopoly in the end, basically, on steel by driving competitors out of business. He creates his company, he starts making gobs of money, he buys up or puts other steel companies out of business, and pretty soon now he has basically a corner on the market. He has basically a monopoly on the steel business, and he's one of the richest men in US history as a result. Here is his Carnegie Steel Company, located near Pittsburgh, established, you can see in the late 1800s, in 1889. He, of course, the Pittsburgh Steelers football team is called the Steelers because Pittsburgh became known as the Steel City because of Carnegie Steel. And so there's your history lesson and your football lesson combined there. There you go. Now, Carnegie's business um, was so huge. Like I said, he created a monopoly on steel. His wealth became so large. They estimate, I want you to keep these numbers in mind, they estimate that Bill Gates' wealth is somewhere around 60 to 70 billion dollars. Billion. Okay. They estimate that Andrew Carnegie's wealth got up as high as around 300 billion dollars. Okay. And so in today's money. And so he, I mean, just think about those numbers, right? So Carnegie becomes a major public figure, obviously, because of his wealth. You can see then, I'm going to show you a few things. We'll come back to Carnegie in just a second. But iron and steel production, just, how it just takes off, obviously. Um, and by 1900, 1905, 1910, 1950. Now, of course, part of this is all timing, right? It's a little bit of luck, a little bit of timing. Carnegie would have been busted if the Bessemer process had not proved to be effective. He was going to lose everything if that hadn't worked out, but it did work out. So a little bit of luck there. Also, like I said, timing. Timing is everything. He had a corner on the steel market exactly when steel was in high demand. Now, what are they using steel for at this time? Right? Cars, appliances, railroads. So you can see buildings, skyscrapers. The skyscraper becomes a thing, right? This is when the New York City skyline starts to take shape, as we will see. So part of it is, obviously the timing, but he hit it big, right? Like I said, Carnegie, though, had become a major public figure because of his wealth and his status. And so he preached what was called the gospel of wealth, which stated that people should be free to make as much money as they can. But after they make it, they should give it away. And this was an interesting thing. He wrote a book about it, and and he's worth $300 billion, right, in today's money. And so he starts giving his money away. He puts his money where his mouth is, and he starts giving his money away. By the turn of the century, the turn of the 1900s, Carnegie had donated the money for roughly 3,000 free public libraries. He supported artistic and research institutions. Um, he founded universities, public parks. So he was giving his money away. Very interesting. By the time he had died in 1919, Carnegie had given away some $350 million in that day's money. And so, obviously then, so is he a captain of industry? Look at all the money he gave away. Or is he a robber baron? Well, not everybody liked him. Workers at his steel plants protested against his company's labor practices. Other people questioned the sincerity of his charity and good works. Okay, um, and so some people saw him as a robber baron. Some people saw him as a captain of industry. I guess it was just all about perspective, but that is kind of the short on Andrew Carnegie. As you can see here, of course, Carnegie Hall, which I did not mention before, is something named in his honor, and Carnegie Hall is today seen as kind of one of the world's premier places where for musicians and things to perform, right? And if you're a master pianist, you if you perform at Carnegie Hall, you've made it, type thing, and so there's all kinds of evidences in society, especially back east, of Andrew Carnegie's wealth and his philanthropy. And so, again, captain of industry or robber baron, which one was he? Well, you want to talk about wealth. You want to talk about business tycoon. Look no further than John D. Rockefeller. In the oil business, he was the big actor. He'd become rich from a grain and meat partnership during the Civil War. And in 1863, he built an oil refinery near Cleveland, Ohio. Um, he got a kind of his big break when he teamed up with a guy named Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was a railroad tycoon, and Rockefeller started transporting his product via Vanderbilt's railroads, and so he became wealthy that way. Well, in the middle of the Civil War, he builds an oil refinery, like I said, near Cleveland, Ohio, and in 1870, 5 years after the war ends, he forms what he calls his Standard Oil Company, which I'll show you in just a second. And Standard Oil is going to be a major player in oil for many years. But he eventually becomes the guy. He's the oil man. He has a monopoly on oil, just as Carnegie basically had a monopoly on steel. And they said that John D. Rockefeller's wealth in today's money was somewhere around $600 billion by the time it was all said and done. So he did the same thing to create a monopoly as Carnegie did. He bought up competitors. He intimidated them into selling. He forced them out of business. Um, and by doing this, of course, he's able to drop his prices, and and nobody can compete with him. And so he he takes over, and it was just obscene, kind of how much money the guy had. Like I said, the Standard Oil Company, formed near Cleveland, is Rockefeller's company. He Standard Oil is going to be, like I said, the big boy in oil for many, many years in the United States. And it's just going to make him richer and richer and richer as the years go by. But eventually, these monopolies that Carnegie and Rockefeller had are going to be called into question. Of course, they had been called into question for many years by the average citizen, but eventually government officials are going to call them into question. And these guys will get their monopolies broken up. Don't feel too bad for them, though. Even after, for example, Rockefeller's Standard Oil monopoly is broken up, a bunch of subsidiary or smaller companies are formed, and he still has a major stake in these companies. His wealth is actually going to increase after Standard Oil gets broken up because of all these break-off companies that are going to get wealthy as well, and he's going to be a major player in all of them. And so, don't feel too bad for him, but this is the story on Carnegie and Rockefeller. This is a famous political cartoon of the day that shows Standard Oil, right? Standard Oil is the giant squid, the octopus, right? And it's going to have its tentacles wrapped around everything, from government to business to the workers, you name it, right? Standard Oil reaches everywhere. And of course, now, obviously, guys, what is oil used for? How could he create so much wealth off oil? Well, just like Carnegie, steel, and steel is used for everything now by the turn of the 20th century. Oil is going to be used for everything, right? Cars, to make plastics, for trains, I mean, you name it, right? Oil is going to be used for everything. And so uh, these guys, Carnegie and Rockefeller, they picked the right industries to go into, certainly. And just for fun, I wanted to show you guys, just to show you kind of how crazy his wealth was compared to the average person of the day. The average person's living in a low-cost apartment, a tenement apartment, living in very humble means. John D. Rockefeller had multiple homes, but one of them, Kikuit, the estate near Sleepy Hollow, New York, was a 40-room house, for example, on 3,400 acres. Built in 1913, it overlooks the Hudson River there in the background, has a view of New York City, 25 miles to the south. And let me just show you, I mean, this is just crazy, right? Look at the outside of this thing. And of course, there are palaces, mansions today that are much bigger than this. But I mean, just imagine in the early 1900s how this would have compared to what the average person lived in. There's a picture from the front. The ivy growing on the outside, pretty cool. There's another picture, of course, manicured grounds and all kinds of, you had statues and fountains and you name it, right? Again, the manicured grounds, kind of to look like a French or a British, palace type thing, with everything precisely cut outside and everything just kind of in place. There's another view, kind of from the back. Another view there, you can see the walls you got to, around it, and just crazy. You have the Greek or Roman elements of the statues there, right? And fountains and the flowers, the yard. There's the same view in the fall, right, when the leaves have changed and fallen and the flowers are different colors, and pretty amazing. Now here's the inside, right? The molding, and you're going to have the gold and the fireplace mantles, and I mean just all of the intricacies, right? Hand carved tables and chairs, and the draperies, and incredible, right? There's a picture of probably one of the living rooms, right, with different things that George Washington, and just different portraits and draperies and mementos, trinkets from around the world. The huge paintings, again, the gold and silver and the chandeliers and the look at the ceiling, how it's carved out, and just, I mean, the average person couldn't have dreamt of something like this, right? But John D. Rockefeller, this is one of his estates. This is what $600 billion can do for you, I suppose. Remember, this house is 40 rooms, right? So how many living rooms, how many bedrooms, and so forth, right? But just crazy. There you go. Certainly would have been tempting to jump from the ledge there and swing down that chandelier, I'm sure. But look at that. Just look at that view. And then another room. There you go. There's the view from the bottom there of that chandelier, and with the carpet, the rug there. I'm sure probably from the Middle East. Some $50,000 rug, and all the different just all the things that he would decorate his home with. Again, everything's carved out. It's all just this is all by hand, right, and stuff. And so you can imagine the labor that went into this, but he wasn't worried about it. He certainly had the money. And then 14 years after his main house is built, he builds a playhouse, which is a French style two-story house, 3 times the size of his main house, his mansion. This playhouse has a 9-hole reversible golf course, has an outdoor swimming pool and 2 tennis courts, has an indoor swimming pool and tennis court, a fully equipped basketball gym, a squash court, a billiard room, and full-size bowling alley. Also has dining and living rooms and a huge reception room. That's the playhouse, right? I had to show you this stuff just to show you the opulence, the crazy over-the-top wealth that this guy had, especially compared to the era. There's a picture of the playhouse. That's crazy. The golf course. That's awesome. And there it is again. There's the indoor swimming pool. That'd be pretty fun. Another picture of the indoor swimming pool. And just look at the surroundings. Look at the windows. I mean, just how cool is that, right? I mean, just how amazing. And so, anyway, thanks for indulging me there on those pictures of Rockefeller's home. That was just an example, right? And so, well, again, we've talked about this. How these guys created their wealth was through monopolies, which is complete control of a product or a market. Now, monopolies are illegal today, or they're supposed to be illegal. But they were not illegal when Carnegie and Rockefeller and others were doing their thing back in the mid to late 1800s. Eventually, like I said, though, the US government got involved and said, yes, monopolies need to be outlawed. They're dangerous. Now, what is the danger in a monopoly? Well, monopolies, if the business owner wants to, they can charge anything they want for their product. Because if they are the only person you can get the product from, then that's dangerous for the consumer because the price of that product could be anything. And so, if somebody owns a monopoly on shoes and they want to charge you $1 million for a pair, well, if you don't have $1 million, I guess you don't have shoes. And so that's the way of thinking. But yeah, so of course, monopolies eventually are outlawed. And again, don't feel too bad for these guys who made gobs of money because they made their money. The timing was right for them. And monopolies create competition, or monopolies, the lack of monopolies create competition. Monopolies destroy competition. And so when you don't have a monopoly, like we don't today with products, you're able to have 50 different shoe companies. You're able to have 1,000 different clothing companies. You know what I mean? You're able to have all kinds of different electronics companies, and they compete with each other, which usually drives prices down. And it's good for us as the consumer, as the buyer. So that's the issue with monopolies. By the early 1900s, monopolies were on their way out. So then let's come back to this question just for a second. Were Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller and others like them, although we focus most on Carnegie and Rockefeller, were they robber barons or were they captains of industry? Well, you'd have to decide. You'd have to decide for yourself. A matter of opinion, a matter of perspective, a matter of how they personally or their businesses benefited or hurt you as an individual. So, but that is the question, right? Robber baron or captain of industry? So are the business leaders today, some of the major business leaders today, are they robber barons or are they captains of industry? It's an interesting question when you think about today's implications. Now, a guy that we need to talk about as well from this period of time, and he will become a major player if you look historically in the economy. In fact, he's going to become such a major player that the U.S. government will have to borrow money from him to uh, to keep from going bankrupt, to bail itself out, and that is J.P. Morgan. And you see evidence of J.P. Morgan, his name around investment companies and banks today, right? John Pierpont Morgan, a financier and banker. He made a fortune by dominating corporate finance, which means he would manage a business's money and or lend money to a business with interest. He was a master at taking businesses that were failing, and he would buy them up and make them profitable again, turn them around, and then sell them. Uh, he also was a master at consolidation, merging companies together to become more powerful. He eventually will be the one to pretty much buy out Thomas Edison. Edison had first a company called Edison Electric, and J.P. Morgan kind of went into business with him. Eventually, bought up the majority of shares of the company and pretty much bought out Edison, and then changed the name of Edison Electric to General Electric. Um, Morgan's going to be the one who is going to buy up Carnegie Steel. He's gonna buy it from Carnegie. Carnegie is gonna sell his blood, sweat, and tears to Morgan. Of course, make a ton of money doing it, right? Um, Hundreds of millions of dollars. Um, so uh, in that day and age, right? So J.P. Morgan is right up there with Carnegie and Rockefeller as some of the richest Americans of all time. Just incredible. But J.P. Morgan, that's what he did. That's how he made his money. He was a shrewd businessman. He was also a shark, though. He was like Carnegie and Rockefeller, cut from the same cloth. He would put somebody out of business with the snap of a finger. He would destroy competitors if they got in his way, and so but his legacy lives on, of course, uh, through what we still see around us in society. Of course, he made a lot of money on Wall Street, right? Wall Street 1867, Wall Street 1900. Wall Street's kind of the financial capital of the country in New York City. And this becomes the place. Stocks are bought and sold, and commodities are bought and sold. And Wall Street will become a major player. It's still, obviously, it is a major player to this day, but it controls our economy, kind of is the symbol of the economy. Um, but Wall Street will, of course, come into sharp focus uh, in the early uh, 1900s, and of course by the late 1920s. Right? We'll get there. Don't worry. So then, to kind of wrap things up, what were some big companies at the turn of the 20th century, the turn of the 1900s? Big companies in this country that kind of dominated. Some of them had monopolies, right? AT&T, the phone company. Westinghouse there on the bottom left. Um, Swift and Armor Meats. Remember Philip Armour during the Civil War, packaged meats to send to Union soldiers. And so this company continues, right? Swift and Armour. DuPont. DuPont makes, well, today, and for a long time made plastics and different kinds of uh, of products that people would use, different materials around the house. Um, General Electric, Standard Oil, Carnegie Steel. These are some of the big companies in the country, and of course, these companies will go overseas as well when they can and start their dominating the markets in other countries. So some of these companies still are around today, right? We still recognize some of these, and these dominated their industries, no doubt. I want you to look at these pictures for just a minute. Percent of billionaires. Okay, this is in today's money, right? In 1900, 40% of the billionaires were in the railroad industry. That's where the money was. You can see at 22% in finance. That's also where the money was. J.P. Morgan, right? We'll start in that group. And 13% inherited their money. Watch how this changes. Think of Carnegie, think of Rockefeller, think of Morgan, right? By 1918, finance, 21%. Steel, right? So finance, Morgan. Steel, Carnegie, 14%. Oil, Rockefeller, 10%. Okay, 10% inherited, 10% other, right? But then you also have mining. You have automobile, 7%. Think of Henry Ford, right? Um, I mean, it's incredible. You just look at but then you can see right here. Here's your examples. Here's your evidences of Morgan, right? Carnegie, Rockefeller, Ford, incredible. And just to show you how much the American economy and grew during this time and how America became a major world power, how the American standard of living rose so much during this time. In 1880, Britain still dominated as far as any single country in the relative share of world manufacturing. The United States was second, but a distant second. By 1900, just 20 years later, we had surpassed England, and now we were comfortably in first place. And by 1913, we were dominating, okay, in world manufacturing. Our businesses were booming. Our factories were going day and night, and the American economy was the best in the world. It zoomed, and so that just shows you how what all this innovation and technology did in the latter part of the 1800s and early part of the 1900s. So there really were two main ways of putting things together, building things, constructing things in a factory during this time. One way was piecework, and piecework had been the traditional way of doing things. You can see this is a watch factory where watches are assembled, right? Piecework is the idea that those who work fastest and produce the most pieces earn the most money. So if you're at a watch factory, if you put 30 watches together during the day, you make more money than the person who put 10 watches together. Okay, if you are sewing blue jeans, if you're making blue jeans, then if you do 100 pairs in a day, you make more money than the person who does 70 pairs in a day. And so, and obviously, right? And so, piecework is kind of the traditional way of doing things, but that's going to change, especially with Henry Ford, uh, in for productivity and profitability. Okay, that's going to change in the form of this: the division of labor. The division of labor is the assembly line, right? And so the assembly line is the idea that you're not sitting down individually and putting a whole thing together by yourself. Your job as an individual is to do one specific task. You do one thing. You put one piece of the overall product together, and then you pass it on to the next person. They do their part, and they pass it on to the next person. They do their part until the thing is put together. And by doing this, especially in a car factory, creating the Model T Ford, which he did at first, he's able to pump Model T Fords off the assembly line super fast because maybe your job was to put on the steering wheel, and the next guy's job is to put on to install the clutch, and the next guy's job is to turn a wrench on a bolt. And that you just do your job. You do your job all day, every day. It sounds pretty boring to me, but that's how you get things done. And that's the division of labor. That's the assembly line. Of course, assembly lines are still used today to mass produce products quicker and more efficiently. Now, to wrap things up for this chapter, the dark side of work in the late 18 and early 1900s was we still had a lot of child labor. About 5% of the workforce in the 1880s was kids. Sometimes these kids, there wasn't a real great established public education system back then. I mean, some kids went to school, some kids went to work to help support the family and supplement income. But some of these kids were little kids. Some of these kids are 5 years old, 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old, and they're working on the factories. They're working with machines that don't have a lot of safeguards on them. They're working at putting their fingers and hands in these machines to fix them when they stop. And kids lost fingers, kids lost hands. Um, Girls learned real quick they had to keep their long hair tucked in or pulled back because it could get sucked into a machine. All right. can you imagine? I mean, these kids would be on their feet all day. There's stories of little kids working all day, and it wasn't just 8-hour workdays back then. Oftentimes it was 10 to 12-hour workdays or more. And little kids would be on their feet all day, and they're tired, and they fall asleep at a machine on their feet, working. And so eventually, I mean, this is dangerous. It's crazy, right? Eventually, laws are passed outlawing child labor, which is a good thing, right? And the government said, no, no, we cannot have these kids working in these factories. They need to be at school. They need to be educated, and so the laws start to change, which is a good thing. I know some of you guys think, man, I wish I didn't have to go to school. Wish I could just work and make money. No, you don't. No, you don't. You're going to have the rest of your life to work and get your education now because you get your education now so you don't have to work at a low paying menial labor job the rest of your life. You want a good job. And these poor kids that had to work back then, you know it was dangerous, it was tough, it was brutal conditions, long hours. And they didn't a lot of these kids didn't have real childhoods, if they're in a factory all day 6 days a week type thing. So be grateful for what you've got, and be grateful that we have laws against child labor today.